time with Deputy Tom.
Please. Thanks, Ciancorla. I think that the heralding of this legislation as a sort of a planned progressive step to ending the situation of people being imprisoned for non-payment of debt is a little bit of a sleight of hand. As other deputies have pointed out, the reason why we're here today on a non-sitting day is because the government has lost the battle to convince Irish citizens that they should pay water charges and that they should buy in to the Irish Water project. Now, what we've seen over the past year in reality is a whole succession of different stages where the government tried to change tack in order to deal with this popular rebellion. And at every stage, you've been caught out. No one has believed the propaganda that this was a charge to bring in water conservation. Nobody trusted you with the PPS numbers. Nobody believed the registration figures that were being bandied about when every postal worker in the country knew about the return to sender registration forms that were being stockpiled in post offices and so on. And people having not fallen for the carrot that the government was putting forward are now being treated to a little bit of a stick or an attempt at a stick. Now, firstly, in terms of the idea of legislation to deal with people not being imprisoned for non-payment of debt, that's already been discussed in this House. It's broadly supported by everybody across the board that there should, of course, be alternatives to prison. But the idea that attachment orders to earnings are the solution to that, to me, is short-sighted and is a nonsense, particularly when in relation to non-payment of fines and non-payment of debts. One of the main reasons for that is poverty and lack of income in the first place. So the idea that we would enact a legislation which enables people's details to be seen by their employers, to have their pay pockets or their social welfare ransacked, I think is absolutely reprehensible. And while I don't have Deputy Wallace's direct experience of community service, I certainly support the points he was making about that being a much better alternative, a cheaper alternative for society, and one that has a better impact on citizens as well. None of us are objecting to the fact that people wouldn't be imprisoned for debt. To be honest, we need an overall discussion on people being imprisoned at all on a whole number of measures. It's a costly and unworkable system that, in my opinion, causes greater problems for society. But let's be honest here. This isn't what this is about, and I think the bill, in the manner in which it's presently proposed, is going to be hugely complex and unworkable in so many ways. I mean, the idea that an employee's personal details would be made available to their employer, to me, is a very dangerous precedent to make. But whatever about that happening in relation to maybe an isolated incident where you hadn't paid a court fine or you hadn't paid your TV licence or something like that, the idea that this is a mechanism which the employers of Ireland are supposed to turn themselves into debt collectors on behalf of Irish Water is completely unworkable in the context of what we know will be a mass non-payment of water charges. And it's not about deputies in here or these so-called mythical leaders inciting the people into breaking the law. Many of our citizens can't pay, and many others are taking the stance to not pay because they don't believe in handing over their hard-earned money to an institution that's really just been set up to raise money to cover its own costs and that isn't going in any way to deal with the problems of our water infrastructure. Now, the idea of the employers having to operate as debt collectors, how is that going to work in a big employment with, say, large-scale non-payment of water charges? We'd say in a company that employs a lot of people, many of them on not great wages, many of them on part-time hours and so on. Who's going to oversee the implementation of the attachment orders? Are employers going to have to take on extra staff in the human resources departments or so on? The courts, the Minister tells us in the legislation, are going to set an amount to be deducted periodically from wages. Well, that that might have been okay in the old days when people had secure, permanent, steady, pensionable employment with a regular wage coming in. But we know in the modern Irish economy, many Irish workers are in situations far away from that, where they've no definite hours, they've flexi hours. We know that Ireland is the second worst in the EU for underpayment. So when their wages fluctuate up and down, as they do, are the people going to have to go back to the courts every second week to get the attachment order adhered to and dealt with in that way? To me, it's not just workers who would oppose that scenario. I think many employers will object to that as well. But of course, people particularly object to the fact that punitive measures are being brought in to deal with small debts of citizens, where the debts of the banks are being shouldered on top of these people, and which are the reasons why people are struggling to pay their bills in the first place. Now, I think that the reason why the government is pushing this today is very clear. You want to create the impression that the water charges are going to be like the property tax, immediately deducted from people's wages. It's in fact a stunt to try and demoralise and intimidate citizens who've made it very clear that they strenuously object to Irish water. Now, obviously what this bill is not that, but you're trying to create the impression that you're going to have more power to compel people to pay up than what you actually do. Because what is being proposed is that if people do not pay their water charges, as many people won't, I certainly won't be paying it myself, we run the risk of being brought to court. And in the instance where we have been brought to court and a judgment has been obtained against us, if that debt is over €500, then we could be brought to court again and an attachment order sought to have that deducted from our wages depending on our incomes, outgoing and so on. Now, as others have said, this isn't going to affect anybody for 2 years anyway, so it's not going to be a problem of this government because ye won't be here to deal with it. And I think we would wonder even whether Irish Water will be here at that time is certainly a debate that we could certainly have. But the idea that citizens who refuse to pay water charges are going to be able to be dealt with in the courts is simply laughable. It would take hundreds of years. It would clock up these courts in dealing with these if householders decide to contest it. And I believe that householders will, because I'm just maybe responding in disagreement with some of the points that Deputy O'Keefe was making, and I have a direct experience of this situation because in the 1990s, when water charges were reintroduced in the 3 Dublin councils, the authorities couldn't combat the resistance of the population and the law was changed preventing them from disconnecting water. So the only power, if you like, that the councils had to try and collect that debt was to bring people to court. That's the remedy that they had. And Deputy O'Keefe is right. Ordinary people don't like being brought to court. It is something that's very intimidating that they weren't used to. But guess what happened this time? When the bills went out and there was nearly 1 bill issued for a person on every road, those people went into court with their shoulders held high as representatives of their community who are making a stand on behalf of others. And court days became days of defiance where people celebrated their resistance and stood behind their neighbours. And as a result of that, we had hundreds of people being brought before the courts. The process went on for 2 to 3 years. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of non-payers continued to not pay. Now, that was 3 Dublin council areas. How different is it going to be in a nationwide campaign where hundreds of thousands of people will not pay? It would take thousands of years to process those if those court cases are challenged. And I believe that they will be challenged, and it is simply unworkable for this to happen. So I would just say that the government has to realise that there's a very legitimate concern that citizens have in their objection to Irish water. This isn't protesting for the sake of it. It's very much the last straw. It's very much in the context that people believe that water is a human right, that people should have access to it on the basis of their need, not their material well-being. It's based on the fact that we know that we pay for our public services through one of the most highest regressive forms of taxation in Europe. And if you want to fund public services, and they should be funded more than they are, then a more progressive form of taxation should be brought in. So in that context, Ciaran Corla, I think this bill is ill-timed. It will be unworkable in the context of water charges, and the resistance will probably be inflamed as a result of it.